I want you guys to imagine that you are me, and I actually want to ask some questions to generate a conversation. And I guess these young people sitting here happen to run an organisation known as Re-Engage that looks after 450 young people at risk, and fact is increasingly being seen as the leading edge youth agency in Australia. In fact, in 2012 was recognised amongst 50 most outstanding Australian organisations under the guise of the best places to work. Having been on a long journey and having seen the evolution within the IIRP, it made me wonder, what does it take to build a truly restorative organisation? What are the features, the characteristics? I really want you to think, what are the things that are essential? And if we think about the IIRP, I guess the first thing we think of is a visionary leader, someone who has a passion and has a commitment to changing the world. But invariably, they've always had an experience that was never satisfactory. And what they've done is they've decided that they're going to make a difference by changing things. And in that journey, they co-opt others. So what are the characteristics of a restorative organisation? If we say that this restorative is a way of being and thinking, what would be the evidence if we looked at an organisation that is integrated in terms of how they relate, how they do business, how they engage one another, families? And I guess I've paid particular attention, being part of the IIRP, and thinking, how has Ted gone around this? How does he co-opt and get really great people? What's the philosophy that drives that? Is there a very clear message about who we are and what we stand for? And the answer to that is it is. And I've always been on the lookout for finding an organisation that I thought might tick the boxes as being an organisation that potentially could become a restorative organisation. And I actually found one. And I guess I've been engaged with these guys for how many years? But it seems like longer for them, of course. 4.5 years. And you know, I started as an inquirer, a coach, a mentor, and I'm eternally grateful because I'm now a collaborator. Because, I mean, when you get to a point in a journey with others, the benefit is universal. We get to learn and grow with one another. What I'd like to do is to help you guys think about what was the journey like for a group of pretty passionate, committed folks who are interested in trying to make a difference in the lives of young people and their families. And we want you guys to hear the narrative, the journey, and what it looked like. Because I think it gives you a template to think about the journey that you may have to take if you too want to be part of a bigger movement, an organisation that really buys into the values we've been talking about over the last 3 days. So let me begin with Kerrie. And I don't want to insult Kerrie, but Kerrie reminded me very much of Ted. And you'll... He's a worry. And you'll get to understand why. Thank you, Kerrie.
Thanks, Terry. They sound the same, don't they? I've got a big voice, so if I'm talking too loudly or too fast, just let me know. I guess a little bit of history and where we came from as an organisation, and that is that I've been working in the youth services sector, both government and non-government, for about 20 years, and felt like I continued to fight the fight around we're here to serve young people and families in our communities. So we're here to help people to create the best life that they can create. Yet my experience in both those sectors, the non-government and government sector, was that I didn't have experiences, or did I see experiences of staff being treated in a way that would foster great outcomes for young people and families. And I was in a particular role, I was managing a youth organisation for a national organisation in Australia, and just same experiences, bureaucracy, the values and visions that they put out and say that this is how we operate and this is what we are, wasn't what I was experiencing as a leader or my staff were experiencing, and made a decision that I couldn't do that anymore. And in fact, I haven't even shared this with Terry, but when I left, I took some time off. I actually took a marketing job, first time in my life that I hadn't worked in the sector, for a friend's international web-based company, because I just was, I'm not doing this again. And I was offered multiple jobs, and I kept saying no, because I thought it's the same treadmill, it's not going to work for me again. And I was then approached by the CEO and the chairman of the board of what was then called the Community Partnerships at Work. And I had worked with them a little bit in the past, and they wanted to develop a youth service. And they approached me and said, "What do you think?" And I got a bit excited, to be honest, and I felt bad for my friend because I stopped being the marketing manager after about 2 months starting with her. And so I had this conversation with them, and I had some not negotiables. And to be honest, I really didn't know what they were at the time, but I just knew things needed to be different. It needed to be a different experience for people, different experience for staff, so that the young people and families in our communities got a different experience. So I had this conversation, it was on a Wednesday actually, and they said, "Look, put something together, put a proposal together and get it to me by Friday morning," to the chairman of the board and the CEO. So I rang my then team leader from my previous role that I had just left, and I said, probably in Australian way, I said, "How about cracking a sickie tomorrow?" I said, have a day off and come to my place and let's write a proposal. And I don't know what will become of it, but I think there's an opportunity here. I think there's something that could be different. And so we did that, we wrote the proposal, submitted it that night, and lunchtime the next day on the Friday, they phoned and said, "We'll give you an 8-week contract to start to develop whatever it is that you think you need to develop." So I rang Tara and I said, "Do you want to quit your full-time permanent job and take an 8-week contract?" And she was crazy enough to say yes. So we literally started working from our kitchen tables, because there was an office that this organisation had had for 15 years, but it was 5 people in it, so it was a very small space. And we had 8 weeks to build some of the back end, some of the processes and structures, and as well as generate some business, because we had to generate income to not only keep ourselves employed, but to also then start to bring people on board. So this is in 2009, so we started with the 2 of us, literally, as I said, from our kitchen tables or our cars. By the end of that year, so this was close to the Christmas time, close to December, we had 37 clients referred to us, and we started to employ people from cafes. We used to pretend that we were just between meetings and that we'd meet you at a cafe on the way between the meetings, because we didn't have an office. We then, I knew the manager of a library from the local council area, and I convinced her to give me 2 rooms that we could just meet in each morning and come together. And we got to a point in early 2010, I think it was. We got to about 10 staff. Ben was number 10, and he'll share more of his journey with you. We then got this really tiny office, and the walkway was my office and Ben's office to get to the other office. But we just had this thought that if we were going to get the best outcomes for young people and our families and communities, that staff needed to have a different experience. And so some of the critical things that we were focused on, and we didn't actually know all the answers at this point in time, but what we were thinking is we need to have some consistent frameworks. Everybody needs to be coming from, how Terry would say, singing off the same hymn sheet. You know, too often in my experiences in these other organisations that I talked about, is you'd go off to, one or two staff would go and do training somewhere, and they'd come back and essentially put the folder on the shelf, and there was no consistency or no capacity for the team to have a shared conversation about what was important and how we were going to do the business that we were going to do. So we started with a critical practice framework, a coaching positive psychology framework. That was kind of our very first platform that we were going to use, and so everything we started to develop at that point in time was based on a coaching approach. And we had started to win some more contracts and started to increase our staff. And one of our contract managers from the government, her name was Cheryl, she said to me one day in a meeting, she said, you know, you guys, you're doing an amazing job, you're doing awesome at what you're doing, but I think you need to meet this guy called Terry O'Connell. And I went, oh, okay. So, long story short, we had a meeting. Well, we thought it was going to be a meeting and a conversation, but he just asked us a whole bunch of questions, which won't surprise any of you. And felt a bit like an interrogation, I think, I'm not sure, but kind of remember walking out of that meeting thinking, I don't know what just happened. We then embarked upon a 3-day training program, and what we thought was a training program, particularly our staff, you know, they'd done lots of training in other jobs and other areas, but they didn't get a training program, they got an experience, one of which I'm sure some of them are still thinking, what happened on those 3 days? And I guess the long story short is we've been working with Terry now for about 4 years, and we've had multiple trainings and multiple journeys. But some of the critical elements and for us is around that we needed to change the conversation. We needed to change the experience staff have of going to work every day. No longer did I want people to wake up and think, oh God, I've got to go to work again today. I wanted to wake up energised and excited about what their day was going to bring. I wanted people to have an opportunity to be creative and be inspired. And what that means is, you know, we use storylines and journey lines with our young people as well as our staff. But what are you passionate about? What's important to you, and how do we shape your job around that? Our interview process. So, you know, I talked about that 8-week contract. We wrote up lots of policies and procedures and did all that sort of fundamental stuff. Well, we've completely gutted all of that. None of that exists anymore. We have changed every part of our staff handbooks, our policies and procedures to be on a restorative platform. Right through to the interview process, no longer do people come to our organisation and we sit there with a bunch of questions. We have a conversation, and it generally starts with a question something like, paint me a picture. If you were doing your ideal dream job, what would it look like, and what would you be doing, and who would be involved? And we start the conversation from that perspective. So, yeah, we just have changed all the conversations we have in our organisation. And I guess to fast track forward, and then I'll see if Terry wants me to add some other bits, but we're now 5 years down the journey from 2009 when we started the organisation. We're now our own independent, incorporated, not-for-profit organisation in Australia. We have 7 offices, both metropolitan as well as some regional towns. We have 53 staff. We're currently servicing about 450 young people a year with multiple government, non-government contracts. But I think the most critical thing for me is that staff get a different experience every single day they come to work, which ultimately means that the young people and our families get a very different experience, very different conversation. They are the experts in their context, and we just need to help facilitate them to understand what that looks like. I'm sure you've got questions.
I won't ask Kerrie some questions. What I will do at this point is go to Ben, and I think I traumatised him in the first meeting. Ben, can you pick up on where Kerrie left off? How did this restorative element appear What I can say is what struck me about these guys were three things. One is this young lady was all over it. I mean, when I asked her about where she came from, what she believed, she was all over it. The second thing is, when I asked about practice, they talked about a coaching model, and they were pretty emphatic about the need for consistency. But the third thing was, she said, we have regular staff meetings to talk about our practice. And I thought, gotcha. Take it away, Ben.
There's no way. Okay.
What's wrong with this one, Ben?
No, you've been talking into it.
Oh.
It's got quite a few implications, really, doesn't it? All right. As Kerrie has said, there's been a number of different evolutions and things that we've changed that are critical to our practice at Re-engage. But one bit that I would like to highlight was a conversation that we had with Terry a couple of years into the journey. We sat down, we said we wanted to chat about what are some of the hardest bits in our role. And so my role at the time at Re-engage was as a senior practitioner, which meant I had a small caseload of young people that I interacted with, but also had a number of staff that I supervised. So I sat down with myself and Lauren, who's here as well, who's a senior prac, and another senior prac who was around at the time. And we said, look, the hardest bit of our job at the moment is actually supervision of the other staff. So we want to unpack a bit about how we can do that better. So as you would imagine, Terry had a few questions for us, and then he actually pretty much just got up and left the room, which I thought was pretty strange. And I was particularly concerned when I heard the door lock as he left, but he set us the task of saying, okay, come up with a template for supervision. What do you want that to look like? What are some of the key elements that would be in that if you were going to make that restorative? So it's not too surprising some of the things that came out. We had a fairly strong emphasis on relationships. How do we actually make sure that the supervisory relationship is a real relationship? Spend time on that, get to know the person. That the communication was explicit and clear, and that we were having the same conversation and you knew what was to be expected. There was opportunities to reflect critically on practice, on what you had done. But one of the other surprising elements to it was that there was going to be vulnerability in this relationship. Actually, you might come to your supervisor and be in a space where it's okay to say, hey, these are things that aren't working, and that you're not going to get told, right, well, you needed to do it better, but actually you'd work on that together, and it's a collaborative relationship. So yeah, we set to work at that. Terry returned periodically, slid some bread and water under the door, kept us going as we kept working. But we came to a product we thought we were pretty happy with. So then our next question was, great, well, let's go and put this into practice. But of course, you can't just do that. You can't just say, this is our template and now we're going to impose it on the staff that we supervise, but rather we have to actually check in with them, do it with. So we took our template. Did that? Can you still hear me?
No.
No,
I told you about that one.
You should have used my mic in the first.
Okay, is that better? Great. All right, so we took our template that we had and we went to staff at an older staff meeting and we handed it out and we said, all right, well, have a look at this. What do you think? We want your feedback. We want your input. They spent, I can't remember how long, probably a good hour or so or longer, just 2 hours. Is that how many? Have I got 2 minutes or did they spend 2 hours? 2. Okay.
No, you're right.
Okay. So yeah, they spent some time on it and they unpacked each bit of it and they gave us some genuine feedback, and they said things like, look, your vulnerability is a big ask. That's going to be hard for us to do. I said, yeah, absolutely. That's going to have to be a two-way thing. We're going to have to be vulnerable as well. And that they liked the idea of building a relationship and having something that was constructive, positive, building experience. So we have a template now that we think works reasonably well. It's not something that prescribes a dot point of this is what has to be achieved in the supervision, but it almost feels more like a value statement. These are the things that we want to these supervision times to look like. So me as a supervisor or Lauren as a supervisor or the other people might express that slightly differently, but it's adaptable and it meets the needs of the people who are receiving supervision, but it also provides us with a framework and a guidelines as to what should be included in there.
So what happened is Ben and Lauren and Barbara asked me if I would set aside some time because they were having difficulties with some staff members who didn't want to be supervised. And I said, so what's the issue? And maybe Lauren looked pretty young and maybe Barb was a bit old and maybe Ben was a bit different and there were staff that didn't want to. And I said, no guys, it's a fundamental failure on your part to engage staff. And I said, you have to work it through in a way where you're clear about what a good framework, a scaffold for supervision looks like. Then you need to road test it in a collaborative way with your staff. And then what I want you to do is to use the same template with your staff and ask them how they would apply that when they work with young people and their families. So there's a consistent framework that is about those collegiate relationships, the supervisory relationships, and in terms of service delivery. Now, Jules actually was part of the same organisation, but wasn't part of Re-engage. And she came in later in the piece, and she's a supervisor like Ben. You pick up where you fitted into the whole equation.
Sure. So as Terry said, I worked for community partnerships at work. Is that better? That better? Okay, cool. So as Terry mentioned, I worked for community partnerships at work, which was kind of the sister organisation for Re-engage at the time. And I'd spent, prior to working there, around about 10 years in operational roles in youth services, and worked for some pretty crappy organisations, to put it bluntly, who, whilst I enjoyed the role and loved working with the young people, it wasn't a really nice culture to be in. I didn't enjoy going up and getting to work every day and mixing with the people, and especially with the management. And then when I was put into management, I found it just didn't fit with my values. And I was like, this isn't what I want to do anymore. So I thought, I've had enough actually of operational roles anyway, I'm going to get out of here. And I started working for community partnerships at work in more of a strategic role. So I really enjoyed that aspect of things, but stepping away. But I saw this other organisation on the side of me, who we worked quite closely with still, doing some pretty amazing things. And it really intrigued me, and I was really interested to find out about what it was that made them different, why they were able to retain the staff that they retained, why they were able to achieve the outcomes that they were achieving with young people. And it really came down to the frameworks that they used and the culture that the staff had deliberately built, from management down right through to the operational staff. Everybody was really keen and really happy to be there, and it was just such a breath of fresh air, a different place to walk into each day. And so I saw the organisation grow quite a lot. From when I was first working alongside them, there was probably only about 10 or so staff, through to about 40 staff. So you can imagine a growth of 30 in only about a year and a half. There can be quite a few different issues and things like that can come up with that kind of growth, which there certainly was. The way that the management dealt with it, though, was the different thing. That was the difference. It was such an explicit way of being able to have these conversations with staff so that they felt aware and they understood what was going on and what their part that they were playing in it. We had a pretty significant issue where one of our staff members was actually put on charges. Now, it was pretty full on for our staff. So you can imagine, working with young people and having another staff member, there's lots of different things that, come to your head and different concerns that those staff members were feeling. And it was quite a hard time for the staff and the organisation themselves. But it was through using restorative practice, different circles, being able to actually have conversations with those staff so they could feel comfortable and open to be able to talk about what was going on for them. That's what helped them move through. It's what helped the organisation move through that really difficult time. And it actually strengthened us as an organisation and our ability to be able to articulate our practice, because we're actually not only doing it with young people, but we're doing it with each other. And then obviously that flowed onto the young people as well, so they were able to experience a better service from our staff, from them feeling okay with themselves. I think leading on from what Ben said as well around supervision, so for myself, coming from other organisations where I've done supervision before, I felt like I was being restorative. I suppose I didn't really know, is what it comes down to. And I was lucky enough to do Terry's 3-day training and be told that I had no idea what I was doing. Well, he didn't tell me, actually. I came to the conclusion myself. Then he told me, yeah. But I was just, we were talking last night and I was reflecting on how I've grown as a supervisor within that time and that space. And since now working at Re-engage, I've been a team leader within the organisation for coming up to 2 years now, I think. I'm trying to work it out. It's been a little while. And I think I was trying to put a finger on what it actually is that's different. And I think what it was is really that it's the framework that I'm able to use now. And not necessarily even the tools that we spoke about before, but around the ability to be able to have those hard conversations and a framework to be able to do that. I would be, avoiding having those conversations with staff in the past, or I would be very in my approach, rather than actually collaborating with staff and having a conversation and finding out what's going on so we can actually work together to rectify any issues that have been brought up and help everybody, move through so that ultimately not only staff but the young people are getting the outcomes that they need.
Well done, Jules. Very interesting. I noticed this exponential growth in terms of staff numbers and made me realise that there was contagion in place and that in the broader industry they were looking to re-engage, and you don't move from 10 staff to 40 to 55, unless you've got something to offer. So being in a privileged position, I had the opportunity to run some circles with staff. We break them into the newbies, meaning those who've been there 6 months or less, or 12 months or less, those who had been there for 12 months, 3 years, and those who've been there for long haul. We asked a different set of questions, but what I asked the newbies, why did you actually come to this organisation and what's your experience? That's where Amanda might pick up. She's been with the organisation for 10 months in a supervisory role. You might pick up on that.
Thank you. Yes, as Terry mentioned, I'm very new to Re-engage. My journey started in January this year. Previously working for another not-for-profit organisation in a very, very similar role. However, that organisation didn't necessarily operate, in line with my personal values, and I found it quite difficult. Interestingly, they had a value statement that was very much in line with my personal values, but they never, didn't really follow through with those. It's probably about the middle of last year that I knew I was at a point where I needed to make a change, and was very thankful that the opportunity at Re-engage did present itself. Moving into that organisation immediately, I could see that this was going to be a very different experience to what I'd previously had. Even on day one, walking in and seeing, just a very different environment. You could see that staff felt valued, they felt respected, staff had a voice, whereas unfortunately previously in the organisation I worked for, staff didn't get that sense. And I guess one of the big things that is a standout as well was the consistent training and frameworks that Re-engage does work under, and it clearly does work. I've seen it in an organisation where those weren't in place, to move to somewhere where they are, very much, very firm within the organisation. You can see the difference that does make. A big thing for myself is seeing a genuine passion for what the organisation what they're there to do, which is to support young people. I came from an organisation where, although a not-for-profit, it seemed that everything came back to money, which was really disappointing. Whereas it's a very different sense, and you just know that it's all about the young people. Another big thing is that around staff feeling valued, feeling respected. Staff have opportunities to acknowledge each other and the great work that they do. From the management to the staff, we are acknowledged. It isn't an easy job. And to little things like having movie tickets, like having a massage chair in our staff lunchroom, air hockey table, getting car wash vouchers, all little things that make you feel valued as a staff member. I feel for myself I've really grown as a practitioner because I've been, I guess a leader, because I've been given the opportunity to. Whereas, again, I keep reflecting back to my previous organisation where unfortunately there was never enough opportunities that did present themselves. Being here, for example, has been an amazing opportunity for my personal growth, and staff, I guess, as well as leadership, are certainly encouraged, to follow their passions. What are their strengths? How can we use them to best utilise staff skill sets? And just an example I have of that is a staff member that I supervise, who's now in a case management role, was previously a chef, had this general passion for cooking and wanted to be able to share that. So he spoke up, he was listened to, and we're able to support him to now he supports a cooking program in the organisation, which he's just on cloud 9. I guess Re-engage certainly was my first exposure to restorative practice. I hadn't actually heard of it prior to coming to the organisation, and it definitely works. Coming from an organisation that, like I said, didn't have any frameworks set in place, it makes a huge difference. I feel that if this was implemented in my previous organisation, the staff there would certainly be having a different experience right now. And I guess it's great now to be working for an organisation that certainly works with me rather than at me. So it's been, certainly a fantastic journey over the last 10 months.
Thanks, Amanda. Ben, in a very practical sense, what are you doing differently in terms of how you engage young people and their families to what you're doing previously before you became a lot more explicit and start to integrate the restorative elements in terms of your day-to-day practice?
So some of the things that I've noticed change over my time at Re-engage, I joined the organisation about a year after it was established, and just before Kerrie came along and started to mentor us through this process, and joined in a case management role. And after a few months of doing that, I came to Kerrie and I said, look, I've got a couple of concerns about the role. I'm not really enjoying it as much as I expected. Previously, I'd been in service delivery roles and community development roles, and I noticed some gaps around particularly the way that we were engaging young people and families. My concern was that if we were only engaging young people, that we were potentially setting them up to fail by not engaging their broader community. We work with them intensively and then we send them home and off they go into their space where everything is just as it was. So my concern at that time was we should be able to engage some of the broader community, and Kerrie said to me, look, great, that sounds like a good idea. Here's this folder, it's called The Challenge. We've got this guy called Terry that we've had one conversation with, and that maybe you'd be interested in that. So I had a bit of a read and decided to stay around, and here I am 4 years later. So obviously that's worked out fairly well for me. But the things that I've noticed particularly are that engagement with families and broader community, and in some really clear and explicit ways. We talked in some of our workshops, so some of you might have heard us already talk about it, some of our intake and assessment processes that deliberately engage young people and families more intentionally in those really early stages, because that allows us to set the expectations of the type of service that we're going to offer them. So in our first initial conversations with the young person is we don't engage them necessarily just individually, but actually invite the family in as well and say, look, this is the type of service that we offer. What are your expectations of us? And then what should we expect of you? And then how do we actually work together to get the outcome that you want? And then our assessment process used to look like a list of questions that was essentially an interrogation. We'd ask them really personal questions that would tick our boxes around what sort of risks that we needed to manage. But that set, again, the tone for the type of engagement that we would have, that this is me asking you a bunch of questions and I'm going to direct where this goes. Instead, our assessment process now is an engaging, collaborative process where I'll get out an A3 sheet of paper that has a diagram on it, and we'll sit down with the young person and I'll take a pen and they'll take a pen and say, look, let's hear a bit about your story. Can you tell me where you started and how did we get to where we are today? And we're going to map that out and draw some pictures and some diagrams and start to explore your life a little bit in more detail. And you can tell me what your life looks like. And then we might flick over to the next page and talk a little bit about their community of care. And on this page we have a genogram or an eco map where the young person's in the middle and They get to map out some of the significant people in their lives and the type of relationship that they have with them. And so we get a broad picture of what their community looks like. Has that just gone again?
There's something about you and
Something
Mike,
about me.
Ben. You might
I just-
pay attention, please.
Terry really wanted me. Is that one working? No. I can just shout if that's helpful.
It keeps,
Timing.
If you threw it at him, you'd be charged with assault and battery.
That's all right. Is that one working? Yeah? Great. Forgotten where I was up to.
assessment tool, the story
Assessment
journey,
tool, yeah, that's right. So yeah, that assessment tool is much more interested now in the young person having an opportunity to explore their story and their life and where they'd like to go, be more directive about what they think is important, and engage them in a process which sees them as an equal and as important participant as we are. They are the experts in their life, and we have some things to offer in that, but that's the way it goes. So that assessment process, it's part of the Terry's flicked me a card. The three stages in that assessment process, of course, are what happened, where are you now, and where do we want to go next. What we found, as with the supervision process that Terry was asked me to talk about earlier, is that anything that works well with young people and families actually works really well with our staff as well. What a surprise, we're all people. So that assessment process that we started with young people now forms part of our critical induction process with our staff. We actually take them through the same journey. Through that journey, we get to unpack some of the restorative practice ideas that underpin it, and so it becomes their induction in restorative practice as well. So we get to address both of those at the same time. So that's some of the critical areas that I've seen change around the way we work with young people and families, but that needs to be reflected not just in them, but in the way we work with each other. So being collaborative internally as an organisation with staff and with ourselves as well. So that if we don't have those elements, then we can't work with young people with integrity. And I think that's the key element.
Look as though it's orchestrated, this whole conversation, doesn't it? Just want to come back, Kerrie, to have the final say, to sort of wrap up, and then we'll open it up. The journey has been a really difficult one, particularly the last 18 months. Frankly, there's been some pretty traumatic things happen, and been lots of tears and lots of heartaches. I guess the question in two parts is, so how did this sort of framework help you to do of that? And the second bit of it is, tomorrow, what does that look like?
Okay, imagine trying to have the last say when Terry's sitting next to you. Anyway, Terry mentioned it, and Jules mentioned it before about we've had some traumatic things happen. We had a staff member charged, and 4 months ago that staff member completed suicide. So it's for a staff team of 50 odd people who had a relationship with this person. It's like, wow, what do we do with this sort of stuff, and how do we resolve? We talk about the 4 pillars in our organisation of restorative practice. One is, how do I be restorative with myself? How do I repair the relationship with myself before I can have a healthy relationship with my colleagues? And then it's about my collegiate relationships. How do I be restorative with my colleagues? Then those 2 things are critical for us before we be restorative with our young people and our families. And the 4th one is to share it with everybody who wants to listen to us. So what it did when that event happened, it gave us a scaffold. It gave us a really clear process around what we needed to do to help staff resolve it with themselves and to help them resolve it with each other. And at Terryism again is we got on the front foot. We immediately put in support processes, but we changed the conversation again, and we had a conversation with everybody. We offered different levels of support. We had internal psychologists come in. It just gave us a way of having a conversation about one of the most difficult things that's probably ever happened in my career. And surprisingly, 4 months later, we're in a really healthy space. And in fact, every time, and I don't wish any more of these events to happen, but when these traumatic events happen, it feels like as an organisation and as a group of people, we come together and we get stronger and closer and better at what we do, because it either makes you or breaks you, you know. You have to push through and do that stuff. But like I said, it gave us a really clear, structured process to have conversations with each other that allowed everybody to do what they needed to do to heal and move forward. And yeah, it feels very different sitting here talking about this right now than it did 3 or 4 months ago. I guess where to now is the future for us. It's, you know, restorative practice isn't some magic wand, and it has never been for us in the last 4 years. It's been a hard journey, but one that I wouldn't change a single thing for. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of work to continue this journey and to continue to build ourselves as a restorative organisation. Every time I go to someone else's workshop or I come to these conversations, my poor self and the staff, I come back with lists of things we need to change and implement and do differently. So we're constantly learning and growing, but I guess a few critical things for us is that I had the privilege on Thursday night with all 6 of us, so we've got a couple of colleagues in the audience and the 4 of us, to go to the RC, so the Restorative Reporting Centre in Sellersville. And wow, what an amazing experience that was. And so I've got a wish list, and I've given us 12 months to open up the first Restorative Reporting Centre in Australia. So that's one of the future goals. I've started a conversation with Ted about we would love to create a relationship with the IIRP and possibly start offering some of the training in Australia and what that might look like. Because sharing the journey, our 4th pillar in our organisation, is really critical. The more people that start to change the conversation about practice and be deliberate and explicit about what they do and be able to articulate it to other people is critical. They're probably the kind of couple of key things, apart from just continuing to grow the journey and experience. And we're just in the process of creating a whole bunch of resources that actually complement our practice and give us a practical way of engaging with families. We call these the echidna cards. You'd know them as a porcupine. It's the Australian version. So yeah, we're in the middle of developing a whole range of restorative resources that give our staff really practical, hands-on tools and resources that they can engage their families and young people with. And, as Ben said, and our staff, we use the same resources in staff meetings, in supervision sessions. So we're constantly demonstrating, and hopefully what we call the demonstrate and inspire model. Just keep doing really deliberate, intentional practice and hope that other people then start asking questions.
Wow. There you go. There, Lauren and Grace sitting there, and do you know, interesting, if they were up here, they would say the same things. What's interesting, it doesn't matter who you get in the organisation, they're bought into a strong belief, and that's how they say things. It's an amazing personal opportunity for me to be part of this bigger journey and to see people grow and to learn and to share, etc. I guess we have some time in which some of you may have some questions, or you may want to make a comment. I'm Terry O'Connell.
I'm Terry O'Connell's friend.
I have got a friend.
When some of my students in New York City hear me speak, they say, "Oh, you're from England." I say, "Yes, Southern England." My name's David Fletcher. I'm on the faculty of Lehman College, which is part of the City University of New York. We have 19 campuses and serve a good 250,000 students, primarily from the New York City 5 boroughs. I'm a faculty in the School of Ed, and my goal, I'll start with the end first. Our goal, and there's a group of us, is to create a CUNY-wide Center for the Study and Implementation of Restorative Practices. This is an idea we've really come to over the past 2 weeks. As you may or may not be aware, New York City has a problem with incarcerating youth, and they get incarcerated at Rikers Island. Rikers Island has been in the news because of 9,000 inmates are incarcerated, half are youth. And the orientation to Rikers Island is you go through the COs and have the shit beat out of you. That is your orientation. A good half of the youth who are incarcerated have mental health problems. This has been sufficiently hidden from the public. Our new mayor has brought this to light, and now it's being federally investigated. But what it points to is, where is the accountability of School of Ed educators? I get a bit emotional about this because when you watch young people spiral out of the system, spiral out of a school, and then get pushed out and gradually end up in prison, you know there was a way to prevent this.
Yeah.
There are ways to prevent this. And so I hold School of Ed faculty, myself, colleagues, partially responsible for this problem. I introduced restorative practices in my School of Ed classes about 3 years ago. I hadn't been to the conference. I knew nothing about IRP at the time. I read about it. And I thought this might be an answer to some of the problems and some of the difficulties that young people experience in the New York City school system, particularly if you're poor, you have special needs, or if you're black or brown. You're more likely to be suspended, and you're more likely to end up in jail. You're more likely to end up with felon stamped on your papers, which means you will carry that stamp forever. It never ends. And so what are School of Ed faculty responsibilities? Well, through this center that we're planning is to introduce School of Ed faculty at a major gathering in April of next year to what is restorative practice, why is it important, and how can you begin to integrate this into your School of Ed programs. And so this is also in working with numerous community organizations, because that I find is where a lot of the spirit and the passion, because these young folks are coming from their communities and they want assistance in keeping them out of jail, graduating, going to college, leading successful lives. So any suggestions anyone has? There are 450 School of Ed faculty in the City University system. I have compiled or paid to have compile a mail list for every single one of them. So no one will escape our efforts. So if anyone has any suggestions, recommendations for bringing School of Ed faculty who are producing thousands of new teachers in this country every year to understand the value and worth and philosophy of building relationships and constructing positive communities.
So Ted, you might like to comment? Thank you. Oh, sorry.
I think that one of the ways, David, that you might start is what I keep hearing Terry say, and you know, it always takes me a long time to figure out what he's saying, but I think that isn't necessarily me. But starting with asking the faculty questions, perhaps in some sort of survey, but a very simple one that just, as this guy keeps saying, which would get a conversation going. And we've been thinking of variations of that. Actually, interestingly, Dennis Wong, who used to be on our board, he's at Hong Kong City University, and he has a an NGO, a center that he created, and it's sustaining itself, which is great. They do trainings, but they had students going around, people who were working with them and students doing surveys on the streets of Hong Kong. It's just a way to start gathering and getting people in the streets thinking about it, and they put it in the paper. So some of those strategies might be adapted to beginning just asking people, have they been thinking about things? What are they thinking?
Thank you. Do you know, one of the real possibilities out of the re-engage experience is what I call this contagion effect. And when you occupy a space in an industry, which these guys do, and there's a lot of other agencies hanging around, I pay attention to the conversations that are happening. For example, I ask those who are there new, why have you come? And they say, everyone's talking about re-engage. Now, I want you to think, if you've got an organisation that's growing in experience, that actually is producing some very interesting outcomes, the fourth pillar of what Kerrie talked about was the need to share it with others. It creates a whole different set of possibilities. And in many respects, I'd like to see re-engage reflect the model practice process that is characteristic of the IIRP, for the model schools, etc. The idea, I really wanted these guys to come and see the restorative reporting centres because, to me, conceptually, that filled a void between imprisonment and keeping kids out. So there's a space there, and I think it fills it really well. Having said that, does anyone have a question of anyone, of Kerrie or Ben, Jules or Amanda? Does anyone have a question? Thank you.
Yeah, the question is...
Jane, why don't you come up, because when they're shooting, they can't see you there. Thank you.
You're very fit.
My question is, and it may be as metaphorical as well, but when you, I know, because I went to your session, you attempt to re-engage disengaged youth. So my question is, the very moment, what's your frame of mind? And anyone personally here can answer. In that first touch, in that first moment of re-engagement, what is the mental framework you bring that, obviously you're successful, that allows you to engage these disengaged youth?
Okay, I'll start and then I'll hand to Ben. It's a great question, and I think I was sitting there reflecting as you said that, and I'll pick up on what you said, which is what's your frame of mind, and I'll go back to the coaching approach, and that is that we have a sincere belief in us that every young person is capable of creating the life that they would love to live. And I think that that's the place I come from. I don't necessarily go in there and tell them that, but where are you at now? Where do you want to be? And how do I help you from the inside out? How do I tap into your intrinsic motivators and your values and help you to create a picture of what your life will be? So going in with a belief that they are creative, whole and resourceful exactly how they are today. How do we get them to look internally and facilitate that conversation? If you want me to go to some pragmatics, when we first receive a referral, we do what we call a leadership introduction. So we make sure that there's a senior member of staff that go and introduce with the case manager or the youth worker coach, we like to call them case manager, my case that needs to be managed. I'm not sure that's a great terminology. To ensure that that family has a broader context of our organisation. And then one of the other things we do is be very, very clear around what our role is. We be very explicit about what our role is and what they can expect from us. And then we ask them to hold us accountable. And we tell them that they're the experts in their lives. Share your story. You're the context experts. We're the content experts. But without your context, we can never give the content or the referrals or the support that will ever make a difference. So very clear that they are whole, creative, resourceful and the experts in their own lives. Sorry.
Let's see if this will stop working again. There's one other idea that I think frames the way we work with young people and what we bring to an initial engagement, and it's about the way youth work is conceptualised. What I think really works fantastically with restorative practices is the distinction you can make between youth work and, say, another profession is that some professions might build a relationship in order to deliver a service to a young person, whereas a youth work profession is about using a service to build a relationship. And that the relationship might not be the end goal, final outcome. Ultimately, we want young people to be able to build relationships with people who are already in their context and already in their community of care. But it's the medium by which we go about doing that. So relationships are central to the way we do our youth work, and that's what's at the forefront of our mind.
So does anyone else have a question? John. Thank you.
John Coutreau. I'm with New York State Defenders Association, and I'm their only restorative practitioner and perhaps the only public defense entity that has a restorative practitioner. My question is, you're all supervisors, correct? And I guess my question really revolves, or I want to try and focus it, is that in your interactions with the people that you supervise, what are the things that they do that are most effective with you in communicating when they have a challenge or they need some change in your behavior in order for them to be more effective? What are the things that are most useful to you as a supervisor and useful to them as someone who's supervised in having that conversation be fruitful?
Yeah, I'm going to throw to Ben to start because Ben was an operational case manager prior to becoming a supervisor, so he's had both hats on.
Okay. Look, I think setting the culture of making space and it being okay for people to give your leadership, your supervisor feedback is the critical element. I mean, every individual's needs are going to be unique, so setting up a formula for that is really difficult. So what we do is just create spaces and say, this is the culture that we want and this is the way that we want you to be able to interact and be able to give us those feedback around your needs. So we use processes like, I'm going to steal that if that's okay. So a part of our team meetings that we have regularly is to create a space for what we call critical reflections and high fives. So they are opportunities to reflect on our practice, and that's the key bit of it, is to what did you do in your reflection about what worked, and that's what we call a high five. I want to give a high five to somebody, that's what worked. And then the critical...
Just they won't know what it means.
Kerrie just wanted a little bit of love there, I think. Or a critical reflection, which is, okay, this is something that didn't work or isn't working, and this is why it didn't work or isn't working, and so I need to be able to change that, and this is the process. So we create those spaces for people to be able to do that. The other part, I suppose, is, like I talked about earlier in our template for supervision, is we want to create spaces that people can be vulnerable, and they're able to say, hey, this isn't working. So I think it's about just addressing it, going, this isn't working, and as long as I've got the space for that, it's okay to be able to say, hey, I need this.
And the only thing I'd add to that is, again, the demonstrate and inspire model that we talk about, and particularly as the manager of the service, it's absolutely critical that I am reflecting my mistakes. So I would always be the first person when we very first started that process. I've got a few critical reflections over my career, so I was able to straight away get on the front foot and share what mistakes I'd made, what I thought about it, and what I was doing to make it different. So creating that vulnerability that showed them that it was okay to make mistakes, but it's also okay to share it with each other so we learn from each other and they're not going to be judged or criticised for it, I think.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Thank you.
I think this goes back to a little bit of what was brought up by the first gentleman in wanting to present this to faculty members who are educating our future educators. And it kind of blends into how do you engage with disengaged youth? Well, how do you engage with disengaged or defensive adults? How do you bring managers who you want to be able to model these restorative practices, how do you bring them on board if they are being defensive or don't see it yet?
Can I just say that issue is really at the heart of the struggle that we're all going to have unless the faculties understand the pedagogy that is needed, has to reflect the essence of what this is about. And these guys could never be really effective restorative practitioners unless they modelled it with one another. Now the truth is that needs to turn everything up on its head. You need a much more participatory, a very different pedagogy, you know, as part of the faculty process. You can't imagine, you can't expect teachers to work it out, you know, alone. If they get to experience what it looks like and feels like, and they're part of negotiating that process, that's when you've got the basis for embedding and sustaining this. But anyhow.
Yeah, I will just add a little bit to that and then I'll see if anyone wants to talk more pragmatically about our what we do. But exactly that, our 4 pillars, and like I think, how would I expect staff to be restorative with each other and or our young people and clients until I do it with myself first, and hence why our journey was very much around how do I restore my relationship with myself, how do I have self-awareness and take responsibility and accountability for that, and then how do I have a restorative relationship with my colleagues. And it's not about hierarchy. Yeah, maybe I'm the manager, but it's about, we're all one. We have the same processes, the same communication and the same expectations for myself, for the CEO, for the board members, right through to our admin staff and everyone in between. So I might, you guys got a...
Jules.
Yeah, so just thinking, we work with a couple of different high schools, but one in particular that we provide youth workers for who are working directly with teachers. And it's definitely been a challenge around trying to, I suppose our staff already understand what restorative practice is about, and the teachers, I think, kind of feel like this is being done to them, unfortunately, because it was the education department that's brought us in. So it's been a lot different to the way that we would normally do things as far as working with this school, but it really has been that demonstrate and inspire model. So, you know, there was our staff are looking at wanting to do circle time and things like that at the start of a program. The teachers are going, no, we don't have time for that, don't have time for that. But it was actually about showing how we could use that circle time effectively and how it was actually going to stop some of that chitter-chatter and communication thing that happens that disrupts the rest of the day, which has actually helped them understand gradually that it is beneficial to be doing it in this way. And also just the way that we've dealt with issues. So for instance, there has been some conflict between the teachers and between the youth workers because there hasn't been an understanding and clarity of roles. So rather than us sort of coming in or the principal or administrators coming in and saying this is how things need to be done, we've been really lucky and had a great relationship with the administrators at the school who have allowed us to come together to be able to have a conversation with the teaching staff, with the youth workers and go, what's going on here? Like, what's the actual issues? And really being able to have open conversations about where everyone's at so they can really, they can identify that they're freaking out about this weird stuff that you guys are doing. What is this stuff? And how is that going to, impact on the outcomes that I need to achieve with my young people? And it's sort of got everybody to a place where they've realised that by having these open conversations, by being explicit, by doing that demonstrate and inspire model, has got the teachers to a place where they realise, I'm going to give this a go. And they've been a lot more receptive to then attending trainings that we put on offer, for instance, and being able to actually start, you can hear them starting to use some of the terminology, which is pretty cool to hear now as well. Yeah.
I'm just mindful of the time. Perhaps if anyone has the last question or thought. Look, personally for me, being part of this journey and having these guys here today is a wonderful thing, because to see the growth and development in these guys, and it's been a really tough journey, and I guess and none of it's been tidy. Never imagine that somehow this all fits together. It's all that messiness that goes with it. But when you go into the organisation, it doesn't matter what entry point or who you speak to, you get a really good sense that individuals who are there actually believe in what this is about, and they always talk about it's a great place to be because they feel that people are treating them respectfully. And the thing that is absolutely true, and Kerrie reminds everyone of it, is that we can't expect to deliver a service to young people and their families if you have staff who don't feel very good about one another. Can I ask you to put your hands together for these young people?